Okay, I'm sorry about that. I, I don't know how to get here any faster, but what?
Where are you coming from?
Just from Porter, but it's like it's way down the hill. So last time I tried walking from here to there, it's like a 10-minute walk. So this time I tried driving and parking in the parking structure there, and it's like a 7-minute. It's,
Especially on foot traffic. That's really what it is. Foot traffic.
all right. Anyway, I'm gonna start now. So hello. Um, uh, First of all, are there any questions about um anything like on the syllabus or whatever? Or anything I didn't explain well last time or no? Okay. So I'll start talking about Aristotle then. Um, so so I said a little bit last time what the point of these readings are. I guess I'll say again, you know, um, um, part of the point of this is to see how people used Aristotle, right? So both like to see how the people from late antiquity and the Middle Ages used Aristotle, and then also to see like what the later people are doing with the Aristotelian tradition, how they're reacting against it, and so forth. Um, um, so therefore, when this is my translation, so and when I translated it, I think first of all, as I said last time, I tried to translate it pretty literally, like word by word. Um, without going so far as to making it incomprehensible in English. But although, as I said, that's what medieval translators did, right? They would actually, um, when you see translations from Greek into Arabic or from Arabic into Hebrew or any of those languages into Latin, like um, they distort the structure of the target language to in order to and the structure and vocabulary of the target language in order to make it possible to translate really literally. But I don't think people would put up with that now. So, um, but I tried to do it as literally as I could, and also I tried like um, rather than trying to pick the word that necessarily gives the best immediate impression of what Aristotle probably, what this word meant in ordinary Greek or whatever. I'm like, when I have a choice, I go with words that reflect the traditional Latin translation of the underlying Greek word. So, because usually those Latin philosophical terms basically exist in English, right? So you can just use them. Like substance is a good example, right? So the Latin word is substantia. It Substance doesn't necessarily give you a really good idea of what Aristotle is talking about here. Um, but if you want to be able to follow the discussion, um, at least in Latin, but like if but there's pretty close equivalence between Latin and other philosophical languages. If you want to be able to follow the discussion from Aristotle through these people and even further, like you have to keep track of the traditional terminology. And then if you say, well, how am I going to understand what it means then? Well, you have to read how Aristotle uses it, right? So, like in the case of substance, uh, which is a very important term, it will be very important throughout this course. Um, you can tell what he means by it because, or you can start telling what he means by it because he gives examples, right? A substance is, for example, um, So a substance is, for example, a human, a horse, right? So those aren't things that in ordinary English we would call substances, right? Like we usually think of substance as something like toothpaste or whatever, like iron, or, that's a substance, but a horse. But, and even though it's the same word, and actually the way we use it in English, um, um, completely comes out of this philosophical tradition, right? Like it doesn't reflect directly the way the word substantia was actually used in ordinary Latin. It comes from the philosophical use of substantia, but the meaning has changed for various reasons. And so when we're reading this, you have to like just figure out how he's actually using it. In the case of that particular word, like I said, it's going to pay dividends because Descartes is going to talk about substance, and Spinoza is going to talk about substance, and Leibniz talk about substance, right? So you should start getting used to what it means. Um, um, and connected with that also is something I wanted to mention about the reading for next time. I'll use my own. Um, so Plotinus, I already mentioned, maybe his dates. I don't know how exactly you know this, but we might know it exactly. Um, um, the one thing you have to realize about ancient history is that um, we don't have very much information about it. So, like, first of all, they just didn't keep the kind of records we keep at all, right? They didn't have newspapers, they didn't have birth certificates, they didn't have like central title registries, uh, but moreover, such records they did keep are mostly lost. So a lot of times we're kind of guessing, trying to figure out exactly when someone was born or when they died. But so in any case, this Plotinus states, and his writings were collected, first of all, by his student, Porphyry. Um, in this case, the dates I found came with circa, meaning, yeah, we're really not sure. Around 234 to 305. So first of all, like Porphyry actually like took notes on Plotinus's lectures, I guess, and wrote them down. And that's the book we have by Plotinus. It's called the Aeneads, which means like the 9 ads, because each book has 9 parts. Um, and but Porphyry was also a philosopher on his own. Um, he so Porphyry wasn't actually his name. His name was Malchus, I think. He was Phoenician. And Malchus, Phoenician is a Semitic language, or was a Semitic language, and Malchus, I guess, meant king. So similar to Hebrew and Arabic words for king. So apparently Porphyry was like a nickname. Like Porphyry was like the purple color worn by kings. But in any case, so he also wrote his own stuff. Porphyry already moved much closer to compromise with Aristotle than Plotinus did. And in particular, he wrote a lot of commentaries on Aristotle. Um, and we're going to be reading a piece of one, for the lecture after next. But he also wrote an introduction to Aristotle's categories. It's called the Isagogy. Um, It's usually spelled in English like this. So isagogy actually just means introduction. Um, and because Aristotle's categories were placed first in the order of Aristotle's works, so you can actually see that um, like this citation here, categories 4, and then it says 1B25 through 2A4. Those things that it knows that Becker numbers, because it's the edition by Becker, are like, so there was an edition, it wasn't the first edition, but it's like the standard edition of Aristotle's works. And on every page, it has 2 columns, the A column and the B column. So when you want to cite a passage from Aristotle, you could write like, so let's say this is page 27, and it's in, it's on line 5 of the B column. You could write 27B5. So, but in the case of this one, it's 1B25 through 2A4, meaning it starts on the first page of Aristotle because the categories of the first book. Right. So, so the isagogy ended up being like, it ended up becoming kind of the introduction to Aristotle. Like the first thing that students read before they started reading Aristotle was the isagogy. And people who wrote commentaries on Aristotle also started to write commentaries on the isagogy as well. It became kind of like an honorary part of Aristotle's works. I mean, not everyone knew it was by Porphyry. It wasn't, unlike some other things that got falsely attributed to Aristotle. It was, everyone knew it wasn't by Aristotle, but still it was regarded as kind of the first part, the first thing you study by Aristotle. And Averroes actually didn't write a commentary on it because he said, there's really nothing in it that Aristotle doesn't say better. It's really just a summary of things Aristotle says. Now, it's funny because if you ask contemporary Aristotle scholars, they'll say that like this book just totally distorted Aristotle's meaning. And that everyone afterwards was confused about Aristotle because they read this stupid book. So, I don't know who's right about that, but for the purposes of this course, the isagogy is part of Aristotle, right? And so part of the reading from next time is going to be from the isagogy about species, genera, and so forth. Okay. Okay. So now I'm going to actually start talking about this material, unless there's questions about something I said. So, so the categories, um, um, so there, so again, who's the eraser?
There's one forward.
Ah. Is there nothing to be done about that screen before?
They just built this thing too.
Yeah, I was wondering why I never taught here before, and then I realized it's because they just built this building, but I guess they didn't really finish it. All right, anyway. So, so there's 10 categories. The word category, again, it doesn't mean exactly what we usually mean by category. It's somehow related to it, right? But it's what it actually means is something Aristotelians have argued about at great length. Like there's a list of 10 categories, but what is a category? Not 100% clear. All right, but I'm going to explain what the most usual interpretation of it is anyway. And whatever the 10 categories are, they're kind of 10 kinds of, well, I mean, what Aristotle actually says is that there are 10 ways that things are said without any complexity. Well, no, I guess not quite. Of things said without any complexity, each signifies either, right? So things said without any complexity, he means like as opposed to um, a phrase like a white hat or a sentence like Socrates is sitting, right? Those have complexity, but he's talking about simple things that are said simply. Each one of them represents one of these 10 types of thing, I guess. Um, so, and the main distinction here is the first one, which is substance, as opposed to all the others, the other nine. These other nine are called accidents. There's sorry, that's 2 through 10. Yeah. So there's 9 accidental categories or categories of accidents. And then there's the first one, which is substance. So, and helpfully, he gives examples of each one. And as I already said, the example of substance that he gives here in the first reading, reading A, the examples of substance he gives are a human and a horse. I should say, so in Greek and Arabic, there's a definite article, right? Like the, but there's no indefinite article. Right, so that is, we have to decide whether to put in a horse or whether to translate it as horse based on the context. In Latin, there are no articles at all. So you have to decide to translate it, whether to translate it as horse, a horse, or the horse. So all the indefinite articles I put in here are all added by me. I didn't put every single one of them in brackets. It's too distracting, but so I mean you could also translate it as substance is, for example, human horse. That's actually going to turn out to be important in a second, but anyway, those examples of substances, there's more examples in reading F. Substance seems most manifestly to belong to bodies, because of which we say that animals and plants and their parts, and the natural bodies such as fire and water and earth and each such thing, and those things which are, the word thing also could be put in brackets almost everywhere here. In English, we use the word thing constantly as a kind of dummy noun. In most other languages, don't use a word meaning thing that often for that purpose. So instead, in most languages, although interestingly, Arabic is like English, but Greek and Latin are more like most other languages, where you can say like instead of saying a red thing, you can say like a red. And that, right, you don't need to fill in a noun there. We in English, there always has to be a noun. And if you don't have a particular one in mind, you have to put in something like thing or person or something like that, right? But anyway, so getting back to this, substance seems most manifestly to belong to bodies, because of which we say that animals and plants and their parts, and the natural bodies such as fire and water and earth and each such thing, and those things which are parts of these or are made out of them, either of some of them or of all of them, such as the heavens and its parts, stars and moon and sun, are substances. So it's living things are examples. The elements, right? The ancient elements are earth, water, air, and fire, are examples of substances. The heavens and its parts, such as the stars and the moon and the sun, are substances. And then he adds, but whether these alone are substances, those are all examples of bodies. Right? We're body here, and basically in general in this course is just gonna is used in a very broad sense, right? Like anything that takes up space is a body. So like the air in this room is a body. Um, it's that's the kind of philosophical use of the word body, right? So that's a whole list of different kinds of bodies that are all substances. And then he says, but whether these alone are substances, or these and also others, or some of these and others too, or none of them, but only some different things, we must examine. Well, no, he does know, but he hasn't answered the question there. That's from book 7 of the Metaphysics. Eventually in the Metaphysics, he does answer the question. And the answer is going to be that yes, bodies are substances, and they're also incorporeal substances, substances that are not bodies. All right. Okay, so those are examples, but what are the examples of? Right? Like what are we asking when we ask something whether something is a substance? So first of all, the word substance, or the Latin word substantia, translates the Greek word ousia or ousia. This word is actually a form of the verb to be. It means like beingness or something. So a substance is a being, or as Aristotle is going to say, it's a being in the primary sense of being. It's something that exists in the strictest sense of existing, or something like that. When this word occurs in Plato, it's usually actually translated as being, often with a capital B. Capital letters were invented later, like in the Middle Ages or something. So there actually ancient Greek manuscripts are written in all capitals and with no spaces between the words. So it's just like a list of block letters. And I think some of them, not that I've read like ancient manuscripts, I've just read that some of them are written this way. Like you have to read this line in this direction, then you have to read this line the other direction. Anyway, sorry, that's a good question. Right. So when this word occurs in Plato, it's usually translated as being, right? So Plato will talk about the realm of being versus the realm of becoming. Plato, in other words, would be an example of someone who says that not these, right? Like not all that whole list of bodies are not ousia. True ousia is only incorporeal forms. We'll see Plotinus's version of that later. But in Aristotle, this word was sometimes translated essentium. Right? This is from the Latin verb to be, esse, right? So like this would be a more literal translation of ousia. And that obviously is where we get the word essence. But in most contexts, it was translated as substantia. Why was it translated as substantia? Well, in ordinary Greek, so in ordinary Greek, people didn't use this word to mean being or something, like people don't talk about that, right? In ordinary Greek, this word meant like your estate, right? Like when you talk about someone's physia, you meant like, you know, their property, their estate, something like that. And substantia meant the same thing in ordinary Latin. So even though it's a completely different word, they used it to translate usia. And that decision was made probably by Cicero. And after that, it couldn't be changed. Um, so, right, and I mentioned that partly because a lot actually 100C, if you're this 100C, you see Locke making a big deal about the like the sub here, like it's something that you put under as support or whatever. But that's just, I mean, I guess in the end, people did understand it that way. And it's true that Aristotle thinks that that substances stand under, that they're subjects, as I'm about to talk about, but it's not actually contained, it wasn't actually contained in the Greek word. All right. So anyway, what, so we're arguing about what are substances. We're arguing about something like what are the primary kinds of beings. And there's a little bit later in the categories. I think this is reading B on I was going to call the handout, but it's not handed out. Anyway, I think this is reading B. There's like a, I mean, he doesn't actually draw the chart, but there's like implicitly a chart that's divided into 4 parts. Yeah, it's B. Of beings, so we have 2 lines here. We have not in a subject and in a subject. And then the 2 columns we have not said of a subject and said of a subject. So it at least looks like everything is going to have to fit in one of these boxes, right? Because these are contradictory opposites. So by the law of excluded middle, as they say, right? Like everything has to either be in the subject or not in the subject. All right, and so then Aristotle goes through these, not in this order, but so of beings, some are said of some subject, but are not in any subject. Human, for example, is said of a subject, namely a certain, and I put in brackets, individual human, but is not in any subject. Not in any subject, right? So over here we have, this is a like a kind, a species or genus of substances, like human. The way he made it clear without having an indefinite article is by adding like basically a pronoun that almost implies that you're pointing to something, right? Like human. Or sorry, right. So what he says is that human, the thing that goes in this box, is said of an individual human. Right, so that's why I say it's a species or a genus. So said of is the relationship between a species or genus and the individuals that fall under it. Or the lower species that fall under it. Then he says, some are in a subject that are not said of any subject. Right, so that's this box here. And then he gives a definition. So, I mean, well, so first of all, what examples go here? Um, he gives two examples. One is grammaticality, which is a kind of like knowledge or science, knowing grammar, or perhaps it just means knowing how to write. Um, but anyway, it's um, it's a kind of knowledge or science that someone could have. And the other example he gives is whiteness, which is a kind of color that something could have. Um, or sorry, no, those are going to be examples of box 4. I'm getting ahead of myself. But for box 3, what he gives is an individual grammaticality and an individual whiteness. So it's controversial what this means, but I think everyone we're reading is going to understand it this way. And so I'm going to explain it this way, that we're talking about for example, like the whiteness in Socrates. Was this Socrates being white and Socrates being black is a common example. We'll see it in Aristotle. It's a traditional example. What is exactly meant by white and black there? I mean, I've heard different explanations. Obviously, it's not a racial characteristic, right? Because it's Socrates is supposed to sometimes be white and other times be black. So it means something like pale and tan or pale and flushed, or like Aristotle actually doesn't use other color terms besides white and black very often. And somewhere he says that that white and black are the extremes and all the other colors are in between. Which just makes me think that like he didn't see colors or something. But that could have been. And yet it's only like when you get to later authors, all of a sudden you start seeing examples, the kind of examples of colors that we would use: red, yellow, blue, green, right? But in the earlier authors, it's always black and white. And I don't know exactly what's going on there. Anyway, so the individual whiteness would be like the whiteness in Socrates. Only Socrates has that whiteness and nothing else. So it's individual because Socrates is individual. So this is, I'm going to write here, individual accident. And then in the sentence, I put it bold and put in parentheses. Again, remember, like, there's no punctuation marks in ancient Greek manuscripts. There aren't even spaces between the words. So whenever you see a punctuation mark, some editor or whatever is guessing where to put it in. So, all right, but he gives a definition of in a subject. By in a subject, I mean that which, like this. There's 3 clauses in the definition. It's in something is the first one, and B, not as a part. And apparently this is the third independent clause, although it's not completely clear. Can't subsist separately. Right? That's is incapable of subsisting separately from that in which it is. Right? So like the whiteness in Socrates is in something, it's in Socrates, but it's not a part. You can't take Socrates apart into his whiteness and the rest of him. Right? And it can't subsist without Socrates. Um, so this is basically a definition of, well, it's a definition of accident, and therefore implicitly a definition of substance. The substances are going to be the things that are not in a subject. So that means they're not in something, not as a part, such that they can't subsist separately. They might be something in something as a part, right? I think I already read in reading F one place where Aristotle says that the parts of substances are also substances, right? So they can be in something as a part, but they can't be in something not as a part, such that they can't subsist separately. So, I mean, you can kind of see how that applies to an individual, to a horse or a human, right? They could be part of something else, but they're not in something else in the way whiteness is in Socrates. And they have their own existence. They have their own separate existence. It doesn't depend on something else supporting them, so to speak. Now, okay, there's more to say about that. I'm just gonna go on with this. Um, Will come up later anyway. So, so now we get to box 4. Some are both said of a subject and in a subject. For example, right, and here he uses two, well, actually, so the example he uses is science or knowledge, right? Remember this word episteme. It can mean science or knowledge. In this case, it probably means science, but it might mean knowledge. Anyway, so episteme, science or knowledge, is in a subject, namely the soul. That's a little bit weird. You might expect to say, namely, an individual human, but instead he says the soul. Is the soul a substance? Good question. Anyway, so it's in a subject, namely the soul, and is said of a subject, namely grammaticality, right? So this is a kind, a species or genus of accidents. And so the example of grammaticality is supposed to be this, that grammaticality is an accident. The individual grammaticality in Socrates is an accident in Socrates. Again, it's in Socrates, or maybe in Socrates' soul. That's something weird. But anyway, it's in Socrates. It's not a part. You can't take him apart into his grammaticality and the rest of him. And it can't subsist separately. It can't exist without Socrates. And then Aristotle is saying that science is said of grammaticality. So science is a genus. In this case, he's talking about predicating the genus of the species rather than the genus or the species of the individual. But apparently they're both called set of a subject, right? And so he's saying that science, right, or knowledge, grammaticality is like one kind of science or knowledge. And the more universal concept is science or knowledge, and it's said of the grammaticality. So an example with color would be, that would also be closer to this example would be to say the whiteness in Socrates is white, right? So white is said of a subject, namely the whiteness in Socrates. Or maybe I should say whiteness. Whiteness is said of a subject, namely the whiteness in Socrates, and it's in a subject, namely Socrates. So, right, so notice it's both said of a subject and in a subject, but they're not the same subjects. The subject it's in is a body, Socrates. The subject it's said of is like an instance of whiteness. or in Aristotle's example, a species of science or knowledge. Okay, yeah, we actually don't hear much about these later. Um, but it seems kind of important that there are things like that. I mean, actually, it'll be really important in trying to understand what categories are. And then, so finally, we're left with this box, right? So this box, some are neither in a subject nor said of a subject. For example, a certain individual human or a certain individual horse. For no such thing is in a subject or is said of a subject, right? So these are individual substances. And pretty soon, Aristotle is going to call these primary substances and these secondary substances. So individual substances are the real substances, so to speak. They're substances in the strict sense of the word. And remember, substances are like beings in the strict sense of the word. So these are what most strictly speaking exists is individual substances. So that's Aristotle versus Plato. Right? Plato thought that individual things are, are like don't fully exist, that they're only images of true reality, or at least Plato had Socrates convince people of that in certain dialogues. um, but but the Neoplatonists always read Plato as propounding serious and unified metaphysical doctrine. Whether that's the right way to read Plato or not is a good question, but it's irrelevant for the purpose of this course. Yeah, so Plato represents a metaphysical position. What is it? It's that individuals are shadows or images and like sensible things like bodies, and it's these things that are the true substances, right? Like human, or as you would say when talking about Plato, the form of human, right? That has true being. Aristotle is reversing that. Um, um, yeah, yes. No, yeah, I mean, no, of course not. Ask questions, please.
He says, this is in B under 33. And the term individual whiteness is in a subject, namely a body, for every color is in a body. My question is about for every color is in a body. In this sense of body, would we then hold that like the heavens or the sea contain within it any color? Because I understand the saying with Socrates can be white and black and that the substance is the same, but what about things that generally don't have a color? Sky.
Well, so I'm not sure if you're asking about things that don't change color, or you're talking about things that don't have a color. Are you talking about things that don't have a color?
No, maybe things that don't.
Oh, so yeah, no, so I mean, because, and we'll see this in Porphyry, so there are examples of, so it's true, and I'll talk about it in a second, that Aristotle wants to use, one of the things Aristotle is going to use the distinction between substance and accident for is to explain change. So how the same thing can be both black and white. Um, so, but it doesn't necessarily go the other way. That is, just because something doesn't ever change, it doesn't mean it's not an accident, right? And so Porphyry is going to give examples of permanent accidents, like the blackness in a crow. Yeah. What to say about things that, as we say, don't have a color, like air? Well, I mean, so first of all, that doesn't contradict every color is in a body, right? He didn't say every body has a color. He said every color is in a body. Um, but his explanation of transparency is complicated. I'm not sure what the right answer to that is. I'm sure if not Aristotle himself, some of his commentators obviously must discuss it somewhere, but I've never seen it, so I don't know. Okay. I mean, because we know air like is one of the things on the list of substances, and yeah. In real life, air is blue. It's just very faint. But if you look at something far away, all right. Anyway, um, um, right. So I guess I should already point out. So when Aristotle makes um, um, a distinction like the one that he's making here, primary versus secondary. It's like a really common thing in Aristotle. That he'll say that a single word has several different meanings, but they're not just random different meanings, right? Not like bank means both like the place where you keep your money or whatever banks do now, um, and like the side of a river or whatever, right? It's but they have many different reading meanings, but one of them is primary, and the others are all because of some relation to the primary meaning. So we'll see about more about that in the next reading. Um, um, that and also the form of this definition. There's lots and lots of definitions in Aristotle that are like this. They have lots of separate clauses. It can be pretty complicated and go on and on. I think both of those things are responses to Plato's Socrates, right? I feel like Aristotle kind of always is expecting Socrates to walk in and say, "Oh, that's very interesting, but what do you mean by," right? Right. And then he's right, like Socrates' technique is to get you confused. And Aristotle, actually, we'll see in the reading for next time, he invented the terminology of like synonymous versus homonymous, and like all the words we use to discuss ambiguity, specifically, I think, to address that, right? So he would like he'll be able Socrates will be able to say, wait, but you say this is a substance and you say this is a substance, and Aristotle will say, well, yeah, but this is really a substance, and I call this a substance because, right? And similarly, like um Aristotle will say, well, an accident is in something. And Socrates will come in and say, oh, so you mean my kidney is an accident because it's in me? And Aristotle will say, oh, no, look at the second part of my definition. Right. So that's what's going on there. Now, why make this weird distinction? Between substance and accident. And by the way, I usually draw it this way. I draw the substance as a circle, and then I draw the accidents as little things sticking into the circle. So, one time when I taught this class many years ago, one of the students started calling these Doritos. Now, pick that up. These are the accidents of the Doritos, and the substance is the bowl. And the prime matter, which we'll talk about later, is the dip. But anyway, right. So why do we want to make this distinction? Well, So it's somehow related to the question that, again, the question that Socrates keeps asking. What is this really? Um, so there's two problems about, I mean, there's probably many problems, but there's two big problems about answering that question. So one problem is universal predication. Um, I say this is a horse, and I say this is a horse. But remember, in Greek, you say this is horse, and this is horse, but they're not the same thing. How can they both be horse? Um, that's one problem. And the second problem is a problem about change. I mean, there's many ancient paradoxes about change, right? There was a whole school, the Eleatics, who claimed that all change is impossible and nothing ever changes. At some point, Karl Popper wrote that like this was the first instance of what he thinks the scientific method is, because they proposed a theory that nothing ever changes, and then they made an observation that things change, and so the theory was falsified. Hey, uh, that's kind of weird, but anyway, right. So here's one reason to think change is impossible, and this one plays a big role in Plato as well. So, so you say, let's say Socrates is white and then he's black, whatever that means exactly. So you say, this is white, or you could also could mean this is the white. Right? You say, this is white, and then later you say, this is black. And how could that be true? The white could never be the black. Right? Like the white couldn't have changed into the black because white and black are inconsistent. So the white can't receive the black. So it can't change. Um, so this whole picture here is supposed to deal with both of those problems, basically. Right? As far as the universal predication things go, you know, and um, I guess I should say, first of all, broadly speaking, Aristotle's answer is that it depends what you mean by is. That, as he says, being is said in many ways, right? Being is one of the words that Aristotle thinks have a primary sense. And again, the primary sense is going to be primary substances are beings in the or are in the primary sense. But then, like, um, being is said in 9 other ways. Um, so when you ask, what is this? Or you say, this is, um, or you ask, what is here? Or, anything like that, the is ambiguous. But then more specifically, the way it works is this. So, I mean, first of all, the primacy of individual or priority of individual substance is the answer to the universal predication problem. And I guess, by the way, I should say, so Plato's forms are also an answer to both of these problems. Saying that what really is the form is an answer to this question, right? So like when I say this is horse and this is horse, um, what I'm saying in both cases isn't exactly true. Because the things I'm pointing out are not horse, they're just images of horse. Right? Horse is an incorporeal form. And I'm pointing up because forms are always up, even though they aren't really in space, right? So, like that's the answer to that. And as far as the changing goes, well, it's the same thing. Basically, Plato says things that really exist could never be both something and not that. They're the same, they don't change. But because we're not talking about real existence, so they aren't really either white or black, they aren't really anything. They're allowed to change, and they constantly change. Right, so one thing, actually, this is Aristotle's report about Plato, that he tried to combine the view of the Eleatics that change is impossible with the view of Heraclitus that everything is always changing by saying that the first one is true in the realm of true being and the second one is true in this not so very world of becoming. All right. So but Aristotle is giving a different and more commonsensical answer. Right, so this is totally typical of Aristotle. I mean, you've probably heard this about Aristotle, but if you haven't, I'm telling you now. Aristotle always, did I say this last time? Maybe. No? I think I did mention this last time. Well, anyway, it can't hurt to say it again. Aristotle always gives, or often gives, a common sense response to Plato's outlandish theory, or that is to the outlandish thing that Plato's Socrates has maintained in some dialogue. But he doesn't get to it by way of common sense, right? He gets to it by building this huge machinery that's not common sense at all, but it comes out right at the end. And it's, you know, in cases like this, it's also our common sense. It's not, you know, like we also, at least when we're outside the philosophy room, we think that horses all have something in common. They're all horses, but that they're also all different from each other. And also we think that things can change color. So that the same thing can be white and then black. So Aristotle is trying to build up machinery that will allow you to give that answer. I mean, he does the same thing, of course, with trying to explain why, like, when in the Republic, Socrates reaches the conclusion that men and women should be equally involved in ruling the city, which is an equally ridiculous, outlandish conclusion from the point of view of ordinary Athenians, right? Aristotle dutifully supplies the machinery that allows you to arrive at the common sense conclusion that women should be subject to men. Right? So it's, you know, I mean, it doesn't necessarily make him a hero that he does this, I guess is the point I'm making, but that's what he does, right? So, and I guess, I mean, it's part of what made Aristotle so dominant for so long. He really, you know, gives explanations of a lot of things that we really want to be able to say. He gives you a way of like an intellectually respectable way of backing them up. Right. So in the case of universal predication, it's, you know, the idea is that what most truly exists is individual substances. So like here's two horses. This one is Bucephalus. Bucephalus was Alexander the Great's horse, is a common example. This one is a less common example, but this is Incantatus, I think his name was. It was the horse that Caligula wanted to make a consul. Right. So these are both horses. That is, this is horse and this is horse. But now what that means is that like, what really exists is two different things in the primary sense, but there's some other sense in which they're the same. Um, and so we're right to say that they're the same, but we're right to say that no, they're really different. This is, and like the way they're different is called numerical difference. That's Aristotle's term, right? They're meaning that they're the exact same kind of thing, but there's two of them. That's why it's called numerical difference. Whereas the other one is called specific. So like between either of these and Socrates, there's more than merely a numerical difference. There's a specific difference or essential difference. Okay, and the answer to change probably is more obvious, right? Like if this substance is Socrates, and we say at this time, at time one, Socrates is white, and at time two, Socrates is black. Well, the white didn't receive the black, right? It's true that the white can never receive the black. Because, but it's okay because it didn't. Rather, this substance first received the white, and then this substance also received the black. This substance isn't contrary to either of them. In fact, Aristotle says that substances have no contrary, right? There's what's the opposite of Bucephalus? Right. So substances have no contrary, but though this substance can, there's no logical problem with this substance first being white and then being. Okay, so that's roughly speaking why we're doing this. Are there questions about this? There should be, there's lots of ways this is unclear. There's many ways this is unclear. Some of them we'll see more about in the reading for next time, but all right, well, there's basically two more things I want to talk about. So one is to go in more detail through the kinds of substances. So going back to reading F, yeah. Well, it can't subsist separately.
It's just non-existent.
Right. Every color is in a body. Right. So yeah, there can't be white and black floating around on its own. At least that's the easiest way to understand it. We will see that not in the case of white and black, but that in a sense, porphyry is going to say the case of hot, for example, like heat, that that sometimes heat is an accident, and other times, like in fire, heat is part of a substance. But he has his work cut out for him trying to maintain that that's Aristotle's view, which he does. But okay, but yeah, so anyway, the simplest way to understand this is no, it can't subsist. I mean, what we know for sure is that if this is Socrates, that this individual whiteness can't exist without Socrates. Whereas Socrates can exist without it, right? Even though Socrates can't exist without some color, It could exist without this color. So, right, so I read this more detailed list in reading F before. I want to go back to some things about it. So first of all, the thing about parts of substances being substances, um, that is important, but also controversial, exactly what he means by it. So like I already gave away, like spoiler, that porphyry is gonna extend it to a kind of composition of what we might think of as essential properties, right? So it's not necessarily a part of Socrates' arm or Socrates' nose. It like the heat in the fire is a part of the fire. So like now, yeah, what I was saying before about taking it apart into like you can't do that, right? But it's still so in other words, it's not exactly clear what actually as a part means here. Um, on the other hand, it's not clear whether so many Aristotelians will say that um, that, for example, Socrates' arm, at least as long as Socrates is alive, is not a substance. It's like a potential substance. There's only one substance, and it's Socrates. Others will say, no, look, it's as Aristotle says, the parts of substances are substances. Um, so that's both, I mean, going to be relevant, but as a good example of like every word in every sentence here has been picked over for hundreds of years. And people ask questions like, you know, does this pronoun refer to this, or does it refer to this, or is it all of it, or is it right? And like I said, like, are these three clauses, or are these really the same thing? So it's really just two clauses. Um, um, okay, the other thing I wanted to discuss about the kinds of substance is, well, let me draw the picture of the whole world, first of all, so we can understand what we're talking about. Can I write this down? I mean, there's a version of it in the reading, so. Um, right, so the world is like, first of all, there's these celestial spheres, right? The outermost one, the sphere of the fixed stars, or maybe one more beyond it, I don't know. Anyway, the outermost one goes around every 24 hours. And then inside it, there's a bunch more. Yeah, so Aristotle follows the astronomy of Eudoxus, who tried to do this using only concentric spheres. Um, so, um, which is hard because, right, like you've heard of like Mercury is in retrograde now, right? Mercury is in retrograde means that Mercury like turned around and is going the other direction in the sky. So like it's hard to explain if all you have is spheres rotating at a, in a uniform way forever. How can you have something go forward and then go backwards? Yeah, I mean, right, we understand why Mercury really changes directions in the sky, right? Like here we are, Mercury is like going around the sun. Sometimes it's going that way, and other times it's going that way. Right, but of course, um, I mean, that's not what would first occur to you. Some ancient people did suggest that the sun was really in the center and the earth was going around, but people thought that view was pretty ridiculous. Most people, because like, why don't we fall off? You know, I mean, anyway, so, right, so Eudoxus tried to make those backwards and forwards things go by adding extra spheres in here and having them rotate in different ways. And then when you add up the rotation, you can get the view we see. So that, right, so the idea is that I guess that all these spheres are rotating uniformly, like relative to the sphere outside of them. But they're not all rotating around the same axis. But they all have the same center. So the center is, it's like the center, right? It's the center of the universe. And I guess I should say, I mentioned that about Eudoxus because later Eudoxus's system, like we couldn't really make it predict the positions of the planets very accurately. And eventually it was replaced by Ptolemy's system, which first of all makes some of these like circles off center. Now right away you're like, wait, won't they crash into each other? And so like Ptolemy's system, no one ever knew. It was always inconsistent with Aristotle's physics. And no one really knew how to make sense of it, but it worked really well. They could use it to calculate the positions of the planets and so forth. And, you know, but Ptolemy also added, they got epicycles, right? These other circles going around a center on the big circle. And obviously that helps with things going in retrograde because they go that way, right? So, right, so that's, you know, that's what's out here. It's really big. It's actually, they underestimated the they had a really good estimate of the distance to the moon. It was made by Hipparchus, I guess. But the estimate of the distance of the sun is way off. So it's actually like 100 times farther away than they thought it was. In any case, but they knew that even with that, you know, they knew that this part was really, really big. And then like in the middle, there's, and these things are like unchanging, except for this constant motion. They're incorruptible, they're not generated, they're eternal. And then in the middle, there's all this crap. And that's where we are, right? And it's like basically it's earth, then water, then air, then fire. Why don't we see the fire? Well, fire is only glows when it's down here in the air, but when it's by itself up there, it's transparent or something like that. Anyway, there's a funny, like in Don Quixote, there's like a whole sequence where they put Don Quixote and Sancho on a wooden horse and they blindfold them. They tell them they're flying up into the sky. It's a magic horse, and then they put fire near them and they say, "Oh no, you're getting near to the sphere of fire." And anyway, so, right. So, and the stuff down here is like, this is the stuff that is generated and corrupted, right? Meaning like these substances down here come to be and they pass out of existence, right? Like Bucephalus was born, Bucephalus died. So as far as bodies go, in reading F, Aristotle is basically first mentioning this stuff and then mentioning this stuff. And reading G apparently refers back to this. So he says, and this is from the metaphysics, right? So reading F is also from the metaphysics. But this is from book 12, whereas reading F is from book 7. Since there were 3 kinds of substances, and I added kinds of in brackets. It actually says since there were three substances, but I think means since there were three kinds of substances, two natural and one the immovable. About this latter kind, we must say that there necessarily exists some eternal immovable substance. For the substances are primary amongst beings, and if all substances are corruptible, then all things are corruptible. But it is impossible for motion to be either generated or corrupted, for it always existed, or for time to be generated or corrupted. Right? So the argument is this, and this is, like I said, he said in the quote from book 7, he said, I don't know, we have to investigate this. But in this quote from book 12, he's resolving the question, right? So he's saying there are three kinds of substance, and at least the straightforward way to read this is that the three kinds of substance are sublunar substances, right? So this is the sphere of the moon is the first sphere. Everything under here is sublunar. So the three kinds are sublunar substances, celestial substances, and incorporeal substances. And he says that two are natural and one is immovable. So natural and immovable are opposites of each other because the way Aristotle defines nature in the physics, right? And by the way, so natura is the translation of physis. So physics and the physics is about natural science. In Greek, it's physics, and in Latin, it's natural, right? So, so Aristotle defines nature in the physics as a principle of motion and rest. I mean, again, actually, the definition is longer and more complicated than that, but that's basically it. The principle of motion and rest. So these two kinds are natural because they both contain principles of motion. And rest, you might ask, wait, these never rest. So there's actually a whole discussion about it. But they contain a principle of motion, or is that in porphyry, or I don't know. Anyway, there's a whole argument about that somewhere. Actually, it's between Philoponus and Simplicus. But okay, so ignore that. There's two kinds that are natural. That is, they're movable. They contain a principle of motion. And there's one kind that's immovable. So immovable means it doesn't move and it doesn't change. Aristotle uses this word kinesis, which we translate as motion, because in Latin it was translated as motio, right? Or motus, I guess. Why do we translate it as motion? I don't know. Anyway, so Aristotle uses kinesis broadly to mean any kind of change. Change in color, change in position, change in position is locomotion. Right. So immovable substances means unchanging substances. And what are those? Well, they're not bodies. And now he argues that that given that we see these two kinds, there has to be an eternal immovable substance. So, like, again, immovable and eternal go together because it can't change at all since it's immovable. There has to be an immovable eternal substance because he says that now the actual argument at the end is a little hard to follow, but basically he's saying, since substances are what really exists, if substances were all generated and corrupted, then everything would be generated and corrupted. And then, and then there's kind of this weird thing about motion. I mean, I guess you have to translate it as something like, how could motion have ever started, or something like that. I think mainly, like, Aristotle thinks that everything would have been corrupted by now. Although that's not really the argument he gives there, so maybe there's something I don't understand. But after an infinite amount of time, there would be nothing left if everything were corruptible. They didn't know. No. Should Aristotle have known about this, about asymptotes? I don't know. Anyway, so Aristotle, generally speaking, thinks that you know, an infinite change could never cover a finite amount of space, time. All right, never mind that. So so we know now that there is an immovable substance, at least one, and it's necessary because basically, like, it has to be responsible for the motion of all these things somehow, right? Like, it keeps even though it's not moving, the argument is that motion itself always has to have existed, and so this immovable thing must have always existed. So somehow motion of everything down here depends on this immovable substance. Now, so this immovable substance, what is it? Well, it's so Aristotle calls them gods, right? And goes on in book 12 of the Metaphysics, sometimes called book lambda, because people, well, in book 12 of the Metaphysics, he figures out how many gods there are. How many are there? Well, there's one for each sphere. So it turns out there's 51, I think. That's how many spheres Eudoxus needed to make the planets move the way they appear to. So there's 51 gods. Now, I mean, of course, this isn't very much like the gods that are represented in the Iliad. These are immovable, eternal, incorporeal things. Aristotle says they're intellects, but what exactly that means, because it's a kind of intellection without change. But nevertheless, Aristotle is saying that, and in this way, he's very much like Plato's Socrates, and perhaps risk getting in trouble like Plato's Socrates did. He's saying that, yeah, those stories about the gods, they can't be taken literally. Things like that wouldn't really be gods, right? Things that, that like can be wounded and get jealous and come down and rape mortals and all that stuff is like that. Something that did that wouldn't really be a god. What would be a god? The most perfect, immovable thing. So according to, I mean, you have to kind of get into this way of thinking. Rest is always better than motion. Because like when you're moving, when things move, they move in order to get somewhere. And it's better to already be there. So like what's at rest or unchanging is more perfect than what's not at rest or not changing. And so like these celestial substances are much more perfect than what's down here, because they only have this one kind of change, right? And it's uniform and goes on forever. So Aristotle, like, whether the gods are efficient causes of motion, that is, whether the gods are actually pushing these spheres, in some sense, is not clear in Aristotle, and I guess most traditional Aristotelians say, yes, he thinks that, whereas most contemporary Aristotle scholars say, no, he doesn't think that. But what he certainly thinks is that these things move the way they do. One way of understanding it is that they're trying to imitate the incorporeal substances. So it's kind of like Plato's view, only with universals replaced by individuals, right? Like, it's not that the incorporeal substances are like perfect versions of the kind of thing that these are. It's that these individuals are trying to imitate, trying to be as close, as much as they can be like the gods. And the closest a body can get to being like the gods is to move in this perfect, eternal, circular way. And the things down here, what about them? Well, they also try to imitate as best they can, but the way they imitate it is by propagating their species. Right? So, like, the, um, um, no individual horse is, unchanging and eternal, but the species is. According to Aristotle. I mean, of course, it isn't really, but according to Aristotle, it is. Um, okay, actually, maybe there's two other things, but wait, other questions about this? I mean, notice one thing about this, that like, a lot of times you hear that, before Copernicus, people thought that we were the most important because we're in the center. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, so it means they can't have the kind of intellect that we have, exactly. But is that a contradiction? I mean, they're supposed to be better than us, basically. Yeah, but I think according to Aristotle and Aristotelians, it's not like, as opposed to, like, so Hume, for example, or one of Hume's characters in the Dialogues on Natural Religion says exactly what you just said, right? That nothing that's unchanging could be called thought. That doesn't make any sense, right? But I think Aristotle and Aristotelians think that, it's like the kind of thought we have that's constantly changing and never gets to the end is less perfect than this kind that it's like they're always in the state that we're in when we just have reached a conclusion and are perceiving that it's necessarily true, right? Which is the best state of our intellect, is what they would say, right? So they're always already there. They don't have to get there step by step. By the way, so Aristotle calls them gods. The later Aristotelians will call them angels. Um, because they're monotheists, so they don't want this God stuff. All right. Um, that was a really good question. I mean, if your question is the same as Hume's question, then you're you're in good shape. Are there other questions? Yeah.
It's kind of ironic that they would think that like planets are like perfect because they keep like having the same like action that is consistent throughout their life, but then they don't see like animals as like anything special. They view them as machines, even though animals are like very consistent and behave in this like very particular way.
Oh, no, Aristotelians don't view animals as machines. No, that's almost no one does. That's Descartes. But I mean, they do think animals, including us, even though we're a special kind of animal, but still we are animals. They do think that animals, including us, are less perfect than these things. Because yeah, it's true. We have, we keep ourselves alive and we keep our species going, and that is the way we imitate the eternal and unchanging, but it's not as good a way as this. Yeah.
So like the most perfect form would be just completely in constant motion. Like we're less perfect because we're in less constant motion. Or we're more changing than the more unchanged celestial form.
Yeah, we're constantly in different kinds of motion, and also we come into existence and pass away. Right, so, again, most Aristotelians, I'm not 100% sure that this is really Aristotle's view, but actually I think, well, no, not all. I guess Galen, who's kind of an Aristotelian, doesn't think this, but most Aristotelians think it's Aristotle's opinion that at least part of the human soul is immortal, but the rational soul, but other animals, yeah, doesn't think they're machines. He doesn't think plants are machines. I mean, yeah, he doesn't think they're machines. That is, he doesn't think they work by parts pushing against other parts. I mean, in some sense, he doesn't think machines are machines the way we do. Right? Like he thinks Earth moves towards the center because the center is the natural place of Earth. And it's better when it's there. And that's why when you try to hold it somewhere else, it pushes me. It's trying to get to the center. But yeah, okay, it's just a couple minutes left. So I just want to introduce a puzzle here that's gonna become more acute in the reading for next time. So what exactly is a substance? I mean, that is like, what properties does it have? So, I mean, I can draw Socrates, I can draw this little picture and I can say this is the whiteness in Socrates. But the truth is, if you look at the list of qualities, one kind of quality is shape. So this shape here is an accident in the category of quality. So I really should have drawn Socrates without any shape and drawn this shape as a derivative. But anyway, that's the shape, approximately, right? And then there's Socrates' size. Well, that's an accident under the category of quantity, right? Like examples of quantity are like, for example, 1 foot long, right? So if Socrates is like 5 feet tall, then that's an accident. So what actually is Socrates? Like when you take away the color and the shape and the size and so on and so forth, what is left here? So I mean, you can see that's going to be a hard problem. All right, I think. Oh yeah, it's exactly time to end. So I'll see you next week. Oh, and don't forget the first metaphysics exercises due Tuesday night, I think. So, okay, see you then. Bye.